At 8:46 a.m. on a clear September morning, when the second plane had not yet struck, and history still believed it understood itself, a set of doors inside the White House began to close, quietly, methodically, sealing off rooms where fear, certainty, ambition, and memory would fuse into a decision that would redraw the map of the Middle East and haunt a generation. Because long before American tanks rolled toward Baghdad in March of 2003, long before the speeches, the protests, the shock and awe, the war was already taking shape inside the minds of a small group of people who believed they were standing at the edge of a new era, an era where the old rules no longer applied and hesitation itself had become a mortal risk. In the hours after September 11th, as smoke rose from the Pentagon and the ruins of the World Trade Center burned, President George W. Bush was rushed from Florida to the safety of Air Force One. And in those early moments, the United States was not yet thinking about Iraq, but something deeper was happening, something psychological and structural, a transformation of how power would be used and justified, because the attacks did not simply kill nearly 3,000 people. They shattered assumptions that had guided American strategy since the end of the Cold War, replacing them with a sense that enemies were everywhere, invisible, irrational, and uncontainable, and that waiting for proof could mean waiting too long. Inside the Situation Room, as intelligence briefings grew frantic and contradictory, Vice President Dick Cheney, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, and a tight circle of advisors began asking questions that went beyond Al-Qaeda. Questions about state sponsors, about unfinished business, about regimes that had survived the 1990s but never truly been forgiven for defying American power. And among them, Iraq loomed like an unresolved chapter that refused to stay closed. Saddam Hussein had been America's enemy for more than a decade, a dictator who had invaded Kuwait, fired Scud missiles at Israel, gassed his own people, and survived a humiliating defeat in the Gulf War, only to remain in power through sanctions, inspections, and constant low-level conflict. And to many inside the Bush administration, particularly those shaped by the Cold War and the First Gulf War, Saddam was not just a tyrant, but a symbol of what happens when threats are left unfinished. Paul Wolfowitz, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, had argued for years that Saddam's regime was inherently dangerous and that removing it would transform the Middle East, creating a democratic domino effect that would undermine extremism at its roots. And while these ideas had once been considered fringe, after 9/11 they no longer sounded theoretical, they sounded urgent. As the rubble in New York smoldered, Rumsfeld reportedly asked whether Iraq could be involved, not because there was evidence, but because the logic of the moment demanded that no possibility be ignored. And this was the subtle but critical shift that defined everything that followed, the movement from evidence-driven action to threat-driven preemption, from reacting to attacks to preventing imagined futures. In the weeks that followed, the administration publicly focused on Afghanistan, and rightly so, as al-Qaeda camps were bombed and the Taliban regime collapsed with astonishing speed. But behind closed doors, the conversation was already widening, and intelligence that once would have been dismissed as inconclusive was now being reinterpreted through a lens of worst-case scenarios, because the fear was not just of another attack, but of an attack that involved chemical, biological, or even nuclear weapons, a fear amplified by decades of American anxiety about weapons of mass destruction and the memory of intelligence failures that had preceded Pearl Harbor. The CIA, under immense pressure, began revisiting old reports about Iraqi chemical weapons programs, aluminum tubes, mobile biological labs, and meetings between Iraqi officials and known terrorists. And while many analysts expressed doubts, their caution struggled to survive in an environment where uncertainty itself was seen as dangerous. President Bush, a man often caricatured as simple, was in reality deeply influenced by a moral clarity shaped by his faith and his advisors, and he came to see the world in stark terms of good and evil, freedom and tyranny. And in his mind, Saddam Hussein fit neatly into the latter category, a man who had defied the international community for years, and who, if left unchecked,
might one day hand catastrophic weapons to America's enemies. By early 2002, the administration had begun to articulate what would become the Bush Doctrine, the idea that the United States could not afford to wait for threats to fully materialize, that preemptive action was not only justified, but necessary in a world where traditional deterrence no longer worked. And this doctrine was not born in a vacuum. It was the product of a specific historical moment, shaped by trauma, ideology, and a belief in American exceptionalism that saw the United States not just as a nation among nations, but as a force with a responsibility to shape the global order. Inside the White House, debates raged, though not always as evenly balanced as later narratives would suggest, because while figures like Secretary of State Colin Powell urged caution, emphasizing alliances, inspections, and the need for international legitimacy, the momentum was increasingly on the side of those who believed that delay would only embolden enemies, and that the United States had a narrow window to act, while public fear and political unity were at their peak. Powell's famous warning about breaking it, meaning owning it, echoed through the corridors, but it struggled to compete with the sense that America was already at war, that history had forced its hand, and that Iraq was a problem that would eventually have to be dealt with anyway. So why not now, when the nation was united and the military unmatched? The midterm elections of 2002 further hardened this trajectory as Republicans gained seats in Congress, interpreting the results as a mandate for strong leadership and decisive action. And in speeches across the country, the administration began linking Iraq to the broader war on terror, not always explicitly, but through implication, through repetition, through the careful use of language that blurred the line between known facts and feared possibilities. The phrase, "weapons of mass destruction," became a constant drumbeat, repeated so often that it ceased to be questioned. And when President Bush stood before Congress in January 2002 and labeled Iraq part of an axis of evil, the words landed like a verdict, signaling not just condemnation, but intent. Behind the scenes, military planning accelerated, with General Tommy Franks and Central Command tasked with developing invasion scenarios, while the Pentagon pushed for a lighter, faster force that would demonstrate the future of American warfare, relying on precision strikes, speed, and technological dominance, a vision that promised not just victory, but transformation, the overthrow of a dictator, and the birth of a democratic Iraq that would reshape the region. Yet even as plans solidified, cracks in the narrative persisted, as UN weapons inspectors returned to Iraq in late 2002 and reported increased cooperation, finding no active WMD programs. But these findings were often dismissed as incomplete or deceptive, because the administration had already framed Saddam as a master of concealment, a liar whose very denials were seen as proof of guilt. Inside intelligence agencies, dissenting voices grew increasingly frustrated, warning that the evidence did not support the certainty being expressed publicly. But in a system driven by urgency and hierarchy, nuance was easily drowned out, and the pressure to align analysis with policy created an echo chamber where doubts were minimized and worst-case assumptions elevated. Colin Powell's presentation to the United Nations in February 2003 was the culmination of this process, a meticulously crafted argument that combined satellite images, intercepted communications, and dramatic claims about mobile weapons labs, delivered by a man whose credibility was meant to reassure the world. And for many watching, it was persuasive, not because it was flawless, but because it fit a story that had already been told again and again, a story of a dangerous regime defying the world and forcing America's hand. Yet even then, massive protests erupted across the globe, millions marching in cities from London to Rome to New York, warning that the war was unjustified, illegal, and catastrophic. And for a moment, it seemed possible that international opposition might slow or even stop the march to war. But inside the White House, the calculus had already shifted beyond persuasion to inevitability. The failure to secure explicit UN authorization was framed not as a barrier, but as evidence of international weakness, reinforcing the belief that America could not rely on others to ensure its own security. And when diplomatic efforts stalled, the administration moved forward, assembling a coalition of the willing and finalizing plans for an invasion that was now seen as both necessary and overdue. On March 19, 2003, President Bush addressed the nation, announcing the start of military operations in Iraq. And as bombs fell on Baghdad and the world watched in shock, the decision that had been incubated in fear, ideology, and conviction became reality, unleashing forces that no one fully understood and consequences that no one could control. The initial invasion unfolded exactly as planned, with Iraqi forces collapsing, statues of Saddam falling, and American officials declaring victory. But beneath the surface, the assumptions that had justified the war began to unravel, as no weapons of mass destruction were found, as sectarian tensions exploded, and as the promise of quick democratization gave way to a grinding insurgency that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives and destabilize the region for decades. Inside the White House, the early confidence gave way to defensiveness, then to quiet reckoning, as intelligence failures were investigated, justifications re-examined, and the human cost became impossible to ignore. Yet even then, many of the architects of the war remained convinced that the decision had been right, that the failure lay not in the choice to invade, but in what came after, in the execution, the planning, the follow-through. History, however, is less forgiving than its participants, and as the years passed, the Iraq War came to be seen by many as a cautionary tale about the dangers of certainty, the seduction of power, and the ease with which fear can override skepticism. A war born not from a single lie or a single moment, but from a convergence of beliefs, pressures, and unresolved histories that turned a national trauma into a global catastrophe. The decision that led to the 2003 Iraq War was not made in one room or on one day. It was the product of a system under stress, of leaders shaped by past wars and future fears, of intelligence interpreted through a lens of urgency, and of a belief that America could and should shape the world in its image. And as we look back now with the benefit of hindsight and the weight of consequence, we are left not just with questions about what happened, but with deeper questions about how decisions are made when the stakes are highest, when fear is loudest, and when the line between protection and hubris becomes dangerously thin. Because the story of Iraq is not just about one war, or one administration, or one dictator. It is about the hidden forces that shape history, the choices made behind closed doors, and the reminder that even the most powerful nations are still bound by the limits of knowledge, the complexity of human societies, and the enduring truth that war, once unleashed, rarely obeys the intentions of those who begin it.